want to invite you to come and join us. You don't have to bring anything. We'll provide the corn and the donuts. And if some people want to help out with some of the barbecuing and some of the prep, let me know. But other than that, we just wanted to invite you, and we're going to eat outside. So feel free to invite people to join us as well, friends, neighbors, anybody that you want to include. Our guys have been continuing to meet off and on a little bit through the summer, but most of the time on. They've been connecting through Zoom, and so if you aren't on the Facebook group that's connecting back and forth and you want to get some more information, talk to me or talk to Victor or Young, or there's a number of guys that can give you more information. We just had our food bank here on Thursday, and we really are seeing good things happen as we serve the community. And our next one is September 9th. So for some of you, that's back to school. If you're looking for some volunteer opportunities and a way to give back, we're always looking for a few more volunteers. And you can talk to Jenna, and she can get you signed up. English Learning Project. We are really looking forward to being able to do that. We hope that we can do it in person, and we're looking at September 25th as the training, and Shanna's here. You can talk to her, or Rachel's on Zoom right now, and you can talk to Rachel if you're interested in volunteering. But it's just a great way for us to connect with the newcomers to Canada that are in our community. And also on the 25th, but after our gathering, we're going to do a party in the parking lot here, and we're going to one of the things that we used to do at Converge all the time was eat together, and we would do it every meal and so every week. And we just said, you know what, with the changing health orders and that, we wanted to be able to continue to eat together. And so we have a group of people that are our food team that has come together with a plan that we're going to do a barbecue after the gathering. We're going to eat outside. We're going to get some fire pits. So if you got fire pits or something like that, can help us out. And we're just going to hang out outside and enjoy the moderately warm weather at the end of September, and eat food together. And so we're also looking for some help out on that. And again, feel free to invite people to join us. If you're like, well, do I have to invite them to the gathering first? No, we're not going to make it weird. No weirder than we normally make everything. So, but we're not going to make it where, oh, you didn't come to church, No, it's like you don't have to pray to eat. Like it's okay. So feel free. They can come to the gathering. They're more than welcome to. It's not like it's a secret. Yeah, you can only come at 7:30. My pastor said so. No, but we want them to join us as well, and want to continue to thank people for their faithful giving. It's because because of the faithful giving, we're able to do the number of outreach things that we do, and we're able to offer them to the community in such a way that we serve them well. And so just invite you to continue to give online. For those who are in person, you're like, hey, where can I give? You have to give online. We're not counting your money here tonight, as we just want to be able to continue to just offer the touchless option. Well, that's the announcements. And before I stay quiet for most of the rest of the night, I want to introduce our guest with us here, Kyle. I'm not breaking any news when I talk about how I felt when I started hearing reports of what they were finding, the unmarked graves in residential schools. And so, it was just shocking news after shocking news. And, I know I'm not the only one. But Kyle and I have been friends for almost 16 years here, and we've talked about a number of different issues. We've hung out together. We've shared season tickets for the Bombers. We've argued vehemently about political issues. But I know this, that Kyle was somebody who was helped me process some of this and pointed me in the right direction. And I went, you know what? This is something that our church community needs to experience and be able to hear from someone like Kyle as well. So I'm not going to share Kyle's story, because Kyle can share what he wants here, but I know this, that he's been somebody who has helped me to see different perspectives and different ways that we can be part of the process of reconciliation, and what that means, because I have my own context and I have my own background into that, but it doesn't mean that that's the same for somebody of Indigenous background. And so we want to be able to talk about what reconciliation really means. And I think as the people of God, it's time to write our place in history of being part of the process. We can't do it for anyone, but I think we need to be part of the process and realize that our history as Christians in this is going to make it more difficult for us to do something meaningful if we're not careful and not informed as we move forward. And so, Kyle, after that kind of muddied introduction, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'll take this off. Thanks for having me back. It's been a number of years since I've spoken at this church. But yes, I want to thank the Reverend Young Hands for having me back. But yeah, we have been friends for 16 years with Greg and Tammy, and Greg and I were just talking about before everybody else arrived about how one time, like Greg and Tammy have been friends throughout the entirety of my professional career, and one time I was working in Dryden, Ontario many years ago. Turns out I was talking about having his little ones out, and now his little ones are now, one of them's married, and one is super tall, all that kind of stuff. So we're getting old, my friend. We're getting really old.
You're getting old.
Yes. And of course, Tam is a good friend too. We've been friends for the same amount of time. She had me out to speak on campus a few times as well. This congregation, I recognize a couple of faces, has also come and volunteered at a place that I used to run called the North End Family Center. So I have a long history with not just the Young Hands, but with this congregation. So it's nice to be back. In a good Indigenous fashion, I asked this evening that we sit in a circle. That way there is no speaking head or somebody that's more right or expert or anything like that. We are all equals, and we all have something to participate. And I purposely did not plan a sermon or a presentation or anything like that. I really want this to majority be a conversation. I really hope you have questions. I'll do my best to answer them, or maybe other people can answer them. And I want it to be an honest, real, sometimes uncomfortable conversation. One of the things that I do for work is I'm a consultant, I'm a speaker, and one of the things I do in that realm is that I offer the opportunity for people to come ask questions. So normally they're off the record, they're not usually recorded, but there's no wrong question, there's no stupid question, there is no anything that, like I said, every question is a good, real question that you have, and we'll have a real conversation about it. So this is also your trigger warning. This can be very tense at some points, can be very blunt. Some things I will say about me and how I like to present is that I once upon a time, for many years, I used to be a minister. I no longer am, and not that now that I am not anymore, sometimes my words and my vocab have expanded, and also sometimes the subject matter just requires certain words that just need them. But again, we'll get into that briefly. But again, I also cannot talk and share without being a good Indigenous man and telling you a bit about my family and my history, because I'm not just me. I come from a long line of people. One of the most famous people in my family history is a gentleman named Chief Peguis. Who here has heard of Chief Peguis? Put up your hand. Yeah, so he, of course, is well known for being initially a friend of the first settlers, colonizers, to this land that settled here and eventually became Winnipeg and Manitoba and Western Canada, for that matter. And yeah, so he's also one of the first chiefs, I think the first chief in Western Canada, if not all of Canada, to convert to Christianity. And so ever since then, the Christian faith has been a part of my family ever since. For a long time, my family were chiefs. and then they turn into ministers, and then so on. And that is my father's side. So I'm a member of the Peguis community, the Peguis First Nation. I'm actually the keeper and protector of Peguis' Bibles. A few months ago, I was in the media because I realized that I have Peguis' Bibles. I had them wrapped in a cloth in my nightstand, and this probably was not the best place to keep it. And I was like, what if there's a fire? What if, I have a near 8-year-old. I'm like, what if he has juice or something like that? Also, I think these are probably significant things for everybody beyond just me and my nightstand. So actually, I loaned them to the Manitoba Museum. So if you want to go see Peguis' Bible, they have a new gallery there. I think it's called the Prairies Gallery. And there's one spot under glass. You'll see a Bible that just cracked open a little bit. That's Peguis' Bible that's been passed down to each generation, and it's been passed down to me. And someday, I'll pass it down to my son. And so it's obviously Christianity, and that faith has been a long part of our family. My mother's side, I am Métis. She comes from a community called Manicotagan. Has anybody heard of Manicotagan? 2. All right. And you probably went fishing or camping there. Yeah? Yeah. Because it's a community of about 50 people, but yeah, there's I think an increasing number of non-brown people are coming there to hunt and fish, and to put up cabins and that kind of stuff. So I am a combination of Ojibwe and Métis. My family roots go long before there was a Canada and long before there was a Manitoba, and I find myself here, growing up here in Winnipeg. With my single mother and my siblings. My father is a residential school survivor. My mother attended day schools for a number of years. And life was not easy. My father both parents, but speaking of my father, he was deeply impacted by his residential school experience and the ongoing racism within this country. To the point when I was a young child, he was not a healthy man. In fact, he was a very unhealthy man. A lot of self-harm, a lot of harm to people around him. And so he was not involved in my life from the ages of 8 to nearly 20. And all the horrible things you hear, and we'll talk about residential schools, happened to my father. He was forcibly removed, some people would say taken, but I would say abducted as a young child, about the same age as my son. He was forced to endure truly horrific things. So as a result, he was not a healthy man. And therefore I was raised by my mother, who also had her struggles and had her trauma as well. Day schools and other things like that were not kind either. But I grew up in the north end of Winnipeg. Grew up under-resourced, which is my preferred term for poor. Poor is too much of a label, too much of a stigma. So I prefer the term under-resourced. And, or even better, currently under-resourced. Life was it was very difficult. It was not easy. A lot of the things, I faced a lot of intergenerational trauma, a lot of intergenerational struggles. I did not grow up with the privilege that I'm going to assume most of you have, and that is a thing we're going to talk about shortly. Life was not easy. However, much to her credit, I don't know how she did it, but when I was a teenager, my mother finished high school and went to university, got her degree in social work from U of M and the inner city campus, and she started her career. Shortly after that, she bought her first house, which was a huge deal for my family. Because before this, before she went to school and all that kind of stuff, anytime rent went up a little bit, we'd have to move. There were times if we were not taken in by friends or family, there were times we would have been homeless. There were many times where the only food in the place came from harvest, from food banks that you mentioned. And also racism and all these things were ever present in my daily life. But thanks to my mother's example and thanks to my mom's dedication and her hard work, uh, graduating high school and university became something that was possible for me. I entered into our community, into my family, which is something else I hope to talk about here recently too, or here tonight as well, is about how people are often limited or not limited by their community around them or by their family. So my mom going to university changed that. It brought higher education into my world. So after high school, I went off and I got a degree in biblical studies and entered into the ministry. And after 4 years of that, that's when I first met Greg, when I was, I think, a neon green young youth pastor in a community just outside of Winnipeg. Greg at the time was kind of like our provincial youth pastor guide, help him not screw up too much kind of guy. Yeah, like don't lock the kids in the church at night on the all-nighter, that kind of stuff.
Don't lock them and go for coffee.
Yeah, twice. So I started my career. I thought I wanted to be a youth pastor. I thought I wanted to be an inner city youth pastor, to be precise, because not having a father in my life, the youth pastors in my church where I grew up became very influential. Became, in a lot of ways, including the senior pastor, the father figures or the male figures in my life. So I thought I wanted to do that. I thought I wanted to be a pastor in a church in the inner city and help guide young people that way. Well, I was a pastor in a church for about a year and a half, maybe less, and I realized, oh my, I made a terrible mistake. This is not for me. No disrespect to people who have dedicated their careers to working in churches, but oh my word, not for me, not at all. It's just not wired that way. I'm not, if you want to use Christian terminology, I wasn't called to that, I realized, after spending so many years and money earning a degree in this field. And so I switched a little bit. I don't think it was a far switch, but I started running a food bank in Dryden, Ontario. And my job there was to be the manager, to make sure the community got fed, but also it was faith-based, so we offered some stuff in that fashion as well. And for me, that wasn't a far leap to go from Christian ministry in a church, serving people, to serving the under-resourced. And because ideally, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are serving the under-resourced. In fact, I'd even say if you're not actively, continuously, sacrificially serving the under-resourced, you should not call yourself a Christian. No. I'll say that again. If you're not actively, continuously, and sacrificially, meaning it's going to cost you something, you're not serving the under-resourced, or the marginalized, the oppressed, do not call yourself a Christian. There's no ifs, and, or buts about that. It's very clear when you read scriptures. It's very clear when you look at the teachings and life of Jesus and his followers. If you're not actively, continuously involved, you're not a Christian. Feel free to challenge me on that in a minute. I'll just point you to Matthew 20:25, the last part of that chapter, and that verse about the lost, the hungry, the naked, the stranger, so on and so on. Or the beginning of Jesus' ministry when he says, "Behold, I bring good news to the rich and the powerful," and so on. Anybody want to take a guess what he actually said? Anybody? Pastor?
You're the pastor.
Okay. Obviously, when he got up in the beginning of his public ministry, he said, "Behold, I bring good news to the poor." And anyways, I digress. So after working in Dryden, my entire career since then has been working inner city communities, particularly the North End of Winnipeg, my home community. I started an organization called the North End Family Center. I ran it for 10 years. But a year after I left, it closed its doors under different leadership. But my decade there, we served tens of thousands of individuals. And I like to think and hope, pray that we made a difference in that community for that decade. And after, since then, that was about 3 years ago. I've been working in different nonprofits in the medical field and helping kids learn about education, that kind of stuff, and also been consulting and speaking. So that is me. And I'm sure I'll share more coming up here in a minute. A couple other things I want to say about speaking in general. If I refer to God with a gender, I'm going to use the female pronoun. Why? Because why not? Just as valid to say she in addition to he. I know the scriptures often refer to God in the male. It's probably because they were all written by dudes. So, but last time I checked, all the genders reflected the nature of God. So I think it's just as valid to say she or they when you refer to God. And so if you hear that, don't be thrown off by it. I'm telling you now so you can stay in the moment. All right? We're cool? All right. So like I said, I wanted tonight to be a conversation about Indigenous topics, not issues, because we're not issues. Topics. And I wanted to make sure that we all have some of the same page here, but I really want most of this to be a conversation, back and forth, a question and an answer. But who here would say you have a decent understanding of Canadian history, colonization, the attempted genocide? Put up your hand. All right. And it's okay if you don't put up your hand, that's fine too. You know, where everybody's learning at a different pace. So, but I do want to start off with some of the high-level basic stuff.
Can I jump in with a couple of housekeeping things here?
Yeah.
Because I was just thinking about this for those who are on Zoom, and that if we're asking questions, we're going to have to repeat them, like Kyle are going to have to repeat them. So here's what I'm going to offer. I'm going to go grab the wipes. If you have a question, we're going to bring the mic to as close as I can. I don't think I can get everywhere, but I'm going to ask you to actually ask your question into the microphone. The other thing is, we want to keep the questions for the Zoom call, but if you're like, you know what, I don't want me asking this question to be out on YouTube, we will just stop the stream if you have a question, and you can kind of come tell me ahead of time that, hey, we just need to stop the stream. Mm-hmm. And it's more important to have a legit question asked than it is for you to be going, oh no, like I don't want this out on the internet. So
yeah, because you're all pretty young people. You don't want to say something right now and regret it 30 years from now. What's the term? Being canceled or something? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
And for those who are on Zoom, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll get to it, and we'll ask it on your behalf. So, sorry I didn't clear that up ahead of time, but
no worries. Also, I forgot to do some of my young people cred. Here we go. Get that out. There we go. Just show. Oh, there we go. Because I know that's the thing. That there's no point in wearing these boots if I don't show off the tags. But I won't. I'll put it back because I'm old. Because aren't I supposed to like make them really tight and roll them up or something like that too? Show off. No. I tease because I like you. I don't know you, but I like you. Which, by the way, is a legit thing. Have you ever noticed that, and this is a broad stroke, but Indigenous people, we tend to make fun of each other and tease a lot. Has anybody noticed that? If you haven't, yeah, Tammy, I think, is especially. Let me tell you something. This is pretty broad. If we don't crack jokes or tease you, chances are we're not feeling comfortable or safe with you. So it's actually a sign of them feeling close to you if we can crack a joke with you or at you or about ourselves. And by the way, most of us, we also like to make you feel really uncomfortable with our jokes. So, so by the way, so if you never heard an Indigenous person crack a joke with you or at you, you can ask yourself why. Why is that? So especially if you've known them for years. I've never cracked a joke around Greg, so it's just, I'm not feeling that comfort yet, just yet.
Oh, the stuff I can't share.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, like I said, I want to start off. And by the way, we might go long. I hope you guys are okay with that. I don't want to watch the clock. I want to have a real conversation. But if you got to go at some point, you got to go. So, question here: who here ever gets confused or is confused or doesn't know what term to use? Do we use Indigenous? Do we use Aboriginal? Do we use Native? Do we use Indian and First Nation? Anybody ever have any questions or confusions around that? Be honest. You put up your hand. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah. I'm totally judging every one of you. No, just and feel free to take notes if you want, or I'm sure it's being recorded. So generally speaking, some of these terms are outdated. If you use the word Indian, you're a racist, and you're bad, and you really should stop speaking. Indian is not all that dissimilar for calling somebody the N-word. It is really, really outdated and quite racist. If you use that term, that's what we're going to think. If you use the term Native, not quite as racist, but nearly almost the same as out of date. Aboriginal, again, not quite as, we're not going to think you're racist, but we're going to think you're out of date. So retire those terms, especially Indian, unless you're talking about the Indian people. There's a lot of them in this world. They have their own country, all that kind of stuff. Use that term for them. Legit, that's what they're called. But not for us, not for Indigenous peoples. And again, retire the term Native, retire the term Aboriginal. The best term, by the way to call somebody, for me, the best way to refer to me is Kyle. If you know the person's name, use their name. But if you're having conversations or you don't know somebody, use Indigenous. It is the safe, current catch-all for all Indigenous peoples of this land. Because who here has thought up until now, if you say First Nations, you are referring to Indigenous peoples? Yeah? You're only referring to some of Indigenous peoples. Probably the majority, but not all. If you say First Nations, you're not talking about the Métis, and you're not talking about the Inuit. And so those are the three big groupings. So let me put it this way. The term Indigenous would be like saying European. It's a big catch-all because there are a lot of different types of Indigenous peoples in this land. Over 200 of us, unique cultures and ways, and we're all different from each other as well. So when you say Indigenous, it's like saying European. If you use First Nation, Métis, it would be like saying Western European or Eastern European, that kind of stuff. You get a bit more narrow. And then after that, you would say Ojibwe or Cree or Soto or Stalo or Mi'kmaq, all that kind of stuff. That'd be like saying English or Italian. Everybody following? Yeah. So, any other questions around that? All right. But again, you may not know, is that person Ojibwe or they're Métis or whatever. It's also not going to be offensive. Actually, it's going to be the opposite. If you just ask us. Just ask.
That's what I did.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I understand. An Indigenous person is an Indigenous person. Like, over here, Greg, as far as I know, you're a white dude. What type of white? I don't know. So what kind of white dude are you? Are you German?
Yep.
See?
Among other things.
Yeah, but how offended were you?
None.
Exactly.
Because German people are cool.
Oh, yeah. So if you don't know, just ask. It's not an offensive question. You're not going to look ill-informed. You're not going to look racist. Just ask. I'll be happy to tell you. I'm Ojibwe and I'm Métis, and I'll tell you my story. Does that make sense? Yeah. Who here has ever been afraid to ask? Yeah. That's fair. It's fair because I know there's a lot of people out there that don't want to seem racist or out of date or be insensitive or becoming aware of the mass atrocities and genocide that have been put on our peoples, which, by the way, again, is another point. Peoples, Indigenous peoples, because like I just said, there's over 200 types of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. Yeah, we're not just one uniform. We're not just Tonto in the movies. So, yeah, that's a first question. Another question I have for you all is, who here would say you have a pretty good understanding of the Indian Act? Almost none of you. All right. Which is not to be surprised. There's a lot of Indigenous peoples that are also not overly informed of the Indian Act. Which, by the way, a little side note here. Is people are complaining about getting their vaccination shots, needing a card to get into places, and Indigenous peoples were like, really, first time? Because where's my wallet? Oh, here it is. Let me show you guys something. Okay, there's this. So first off, just for the record, so you guys know, I am double vaxxed. There you go. But here is my card that certifies that I'm a certified Indian. I have Indian status. So, if you're complaining about getting a vaccination card, you're getting off easy. And I need that from time to time to prove my Indianness towards the government and other things. But the Indian Act is an atrocious piece of policy and law that has changed this country for large and away the worst. Is the Indian Act, which was, of course, a law or laws brought in by the federal government nearly at the beginning of Canada. So it's almost as old as Canada. And what they brought in through the Indian Act was residential schools, the reserve system, First Nations as we call them, or even better, Indigenous communities. Yeah, by the way, Greg, if anybody pops in with a question online, let me know. So they said they created the residential schools, they created reserves, and they created the band council, the chief and council you might have heard referred to, because large in a way before the Indian Act, Indigenous communities like mine were not ruled by the way they are now. It was often passed down through family ties. Somebody would be raised and groomed to be a leader and a chief in the community. The Indian Act changed that. I'll just speak about the one I know best, Peguis, my community. Up until recently, the Indian Act required there be an election for chief and council every 2 years. I know people complain. I know we're right in the middle of a federal election. People complain about there being an election too many times, too often. But think about that, guaranteed an election every 2 years. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there was a mandated, and there's a lot of Indigenous communities across the nation that still have that law in place. Why do you think 2 years? What would be your guess? This is where I'm going to play teacher, and everybody's not going to look at have eye contact with me. But if somebody doesn't guess, I'm going to pick somebody. Anybody? Sorry? Create division. Yes, absolutely. Because you're always basically in election mode, and nobody can ever get really settled to do something, to have a real mandate, to really kind of gain momentum. You're always in perpetual change. And it's one of the tactics of oppression. Also, who here has heard that up until the 60s, reserves were basically prisons? You could not leave the reserve. If you did, you'd probably be arrested or killed. So these places were not created to keep us safe. They were to confine us, keep us away. There's a reason why most First Nations communities are nowhere close to any populous places of Canada. They purposely put us off and away, out of sight, out of mind, and they locked us in there. If you wanted to leave, you needed to request a pass from the Indian agent. And if you wanted to do commerce, like say if you wanted to say go sell some livestock, often the pass fee was higher than what you would get for your livestock or whatever you're going to do for that day. Who here is also aware that Indigenous peoples, large in a way, did not have the right to vote into the 60s? Yeah. We all celebrate rightfully, when women got the vote. I think it was in the 20s, am I correct? It was another 40 years until we can vote without having to give up our Indigenous rights. We could vote before that, but we had to give up our Indian status. We had to give up any treaty rights that we had. If we wanted to join the military, basically if we wanted to serve this country, we still had to give up our Indigenous rights, our status, anything. And basically, if we ever wanted to leave the community, we had to stop being an Indian. And we could not go back. But of course, one of the biggest, most evil things in human history that the Indian Act created was residential schools. Schools. They were certainly not schools by really any measure that you would have calling places schools these days. And I'll just say from the beginning, I don't think anybody here would have this challenge, but I've heard it many times. There was no good intention with residential schools. They did not have good intentions. Even at the time, people knew it was wrong. Residential schools were created to rid this planet of Indigenous peoples. It was expressly said like that in the Houses of Parliament and around the country. They weren't trying to teach us, they weren't trying to save us, they were trying to kill us. The idea was to take the kids away from their families, have them raised in a non-Indigenous way, so that within a generation or two, there would be no longer any Indigenous cultures on this planet. That is why we call it a cultural genocide. So, this is why I'm asking you to be honest, and I'm not gonna get up and challenge you directly. But who here has heard that, or even thought that maybe that, they had good intentions? We can't judge people from the past by today's standards. Who has heard that? Maybe you have some friends or family who have said that, who think that, who still say that. It's blatantly not true. All you have to do is do a little bit of research, 5 minutes of research on Google. You look up John A. Macdonald and Ryerson and the architects of residential schools. I heard Ryerson University took the right step to formally change their names because Ryerson was one of the architects of residential schools. And some really god-awful things happen. Kids. Again, I know when we talk about residential school survivors, we now see a bunch of elders. But we're talking about kids. 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, all the way up into the teenage years. Kids were forcibly removed, stolen, kidnapped, taken from their families for no other reason than that they were just stupid little Indian kids. Savages. Less than human. Needing God in their life. Needing education in their life. Never mind the fact that we have had cultures, thriving cultures in education and families for millennia before any colonizers came this way. But just by the pure sin of being brown, we were taken, forcibly abducted. Because taken just doesn't sound quite enough. People sometimes ask, well, why didn't people fight back? Well, some did. They were often imprisoned or they were killed. And sometimes they hid their kids and their grandkids in the woods. but nearly 300,000 children were forcibly removed and put into Indian residential schools, where there was very little actual schooling happened there. Talking with my father, it largely consisted of chores, chapel, beatings, etc., etc. And they purposely put these institutions far away from their home communities because it made it harder to travel. My father was taught as a young boy that if you're going to run away, run down the train tracks. That was kind of the inside knowledge. If you're going to escape, run home, run down the train tracks. But of course, people figured that out, and that was also how they got recaptured. But even before that, my father actually published a book last year where he tells his story where he remembers being taken from his parents, thrown on a bus, brought to Winnipeg before he got transferred to a school. 7-year-old kid, alone, not fed, terrified, didn't even know where to go to the bathroom, had to sit in his own piss at the train station. And he spent a couple of years at this institution, often not being referred to by name, often just be referred to as a number. Literally being beaten to near death a few times for speaking his language. And one day, after chapel, he saw his sister across the way. He's probably about 8 at this point, maybe 9. Again, has not seen, talked to a family member in years. Sees his sister. So what does he do? This little boy runs and grabs and holds his sister, who turns out was there for a while herself, but they separated the boys and the girls. And they hugged, they embraced. They both got a severe beating for that. Because, like an 8-year-old boy, wanted to hug his sister. And when it comes to Christianity, Christianity has a lot to atone for when it comes to Indigenous peoples. Something I heard my father say once, and I say repeatedly when I speak, is that the people that were teaching him about the love of Jesus and how Jesus needed to enter into his life, to come into his life, were sometimes the same people that were coming into him every night. Because they would take these little boys' pants down and take them and rape them. Or if they were female, they would take them and keep raping them. A child. And then a teenager. This happened to hundreds of thousands of kids in this land. And the final school institution was not closed until 1996. Most of them disappeared in the 70s, in the 60s. Guess what? They were replaced by this idea called the 60s scoop. Instead of putting them in institutions, they would take them and put them in different places around the country or around the continent in families or foster homes. And still with the intent of not having them being raised within their culture or with their families. And that often was when the 60s scoop finally started the wane in the 90s, that the people will rightfully say these days, especially here in Manitoba, the current day, the modern day residential school is CFS, Child and Family Services. There's about 11,000 children part of the Child and Family Services system here in Manitoba. Over 10,000 of them or Indigenous. So they're still taking our kids. They're just doing it in a different way. They're punishing Indigenous parents because we have been so deeply impacted by all these things. We just barely scratched the surface so far. But when you forcibly remove generations of people from their families, you're going to have very damaged kids grow up to very damaged adults. And you think about the communities back home. How weird would it be to live in a community where there's nobody under the age of 18? Think about those parents and those grandparents. What they had to endure. Chances are they knew full well what their kids were going to because when they were taken from them, because they had to do it themselves. You might start drinking. You might start turning to other harmful activities. You might even take your own life. This in combination with the fact that you live in a prison called a reserve. And you don't have the legal right to sue the government. Canada has done some fucked up things when it comes to Indigenous peoples. Still is. On almost every system within our society, particularly the negative ones, like child and family services, like the healthcare system, like the incarceration system, etc., we are dramatically overrepresented. I think it says the stats is something like Indigenous women are about 4% of the Canadian population, but they are about 15% of the murdered and missing women in this country. Again, we are strongly disappointed, hugely overrepresented in every system you don't want to be. And we're largely underrepresented in all the systems you do want to be, like higher education, high school graduation, home ownership, employment. Because these things are continuing just in different ways. They're systematic, they are intentional. And I'm not going to blame any of you for putting these systems in place. But this conversation, along with other things I'm sure in your life, you now know better. And I'm expecting you to do better now and going throughout the rest of your life. Nobody's going to judge you for your family or your ancestors' actions. But you will be held accountable by people here on this planet, and also by the God you believe in, for the actions that you take or you don't take, now that you know. Not unlike if you know that your neighbor uses his wife as a punching bag every single night, and you do nothing, you don't intervene, you don't call the police, you don't do something to try help her, you're not to blame for being a wife beater, but you're involved, and you're not, you're not sin-free if you just let her be beat up every single night. You know better. You have to do better. So we talked about systematic stuff. I also mentioned privilege earlier. Systems that are against us, and basically every single one. Whether it be the healthcare system or the criminal system or whatever. Like, who here would look at the police and see them as protectors of the community? The North End and beyond where I'm from, we see them as a potential beating. Out of habit, the times that I've been pulled over, out of habit, I know what to do. I know to turn on all the lights possible in my car, to put my hands on the wheel, and don't move, because I want to live through this experience. Who here has ever been pulled over by the police and worried that you might die or you might get beat up? Anybody? One time, I wasn't thinking, but my partner and I, we were in our car, and I think we were tracking this car that was, I think it involved a hit and run, and she was on the phone with the police and saying, we see the car, we're behind them, and they said, okay, well, don't keep following, so we stopped, and then a cop car pulled up behind us. And not thinking, I forgot all that training for a second, I hopped out of the car and to stand in front of the car. You would not believe how quick they got out of their car and they started reaching for their gun. Yeah. Being an Indigenous guy in the North End, I should have known better. My partner was very scared, rightfully. So have you never thought about, am I going to get beat up or worse from the police? That is privilege. Also, of course, what probably generated this invite to come and speak with you, of course, is now the over 5,000 unmarked bodies of children being recovered, not discovered. We knew they were there. The government knew they were there. The churches knew they were there. So we're not discovering, we're simply uncovering them. Which, by the way, is really messed up. Who here would send anybody to a school where up to 50% of the people are going to die there? Nobody. I don't think anybody would send their kids to any place where the school requires a graveyard on site. But like I said, we're now over 5,000, which by the way, why is it not being spoken about more in the media? I asked somebody that question, and he said, well, you can't expect us to sit in this grief. And I said, why the hell not? We are. You have the privilege to turn the channel, to click the next thing, or keep scrolling on social media. So if all these systematic things, and again, we're just barely scratching the surface here, don't impact your life on a daily basis, that is privilege. If you're able not to think about it for a day, that is privilege. I can keep going on and on and on, but I said I want this to be a conversation with some questions. So I purposely just covered a couple of quick things to hopefully start a conversation with some questions. Again, there's no wrong question, there's no stupid question. And you're asking a question because you want to learn, and that is good. This is a safe place. Nobody's going to think of less of you. We can all learn together.
So just so you know, like I have talked to Kyle about some of these things, and I have pushed back. And I've said, I don't understand. I was taught this. I took a course, college level course, Canadian history. After taking that course, I didn't know anything about residential schools. And that was, it was 30 years ago, but it was still going on at that time, and I'm still not getting that information. And so if you are feeling challenged and you're like, but I've heard this.
Let's talk.
That's a good time to get it out. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we do want to look at too is how do we move forward? Yeah,
we'll get to that for sure. That's how we're going to end.
But if there's push, if there's question, if there's clarification needed, ask it as a clarification question.
Mm-hmm. But that's a good point. We are going to end on what are the next steps going forward. And we're all going to end as friends. So.
Anybody want to ask anything?
Right. Hey, he's going to come with a mic.
I think I got to meet you
about there, eh?
Can you just talk about like the similarities and differences between like Christianity and then what the Indigenous peoples believe?
Sure. I don't. Dan, did the mic pick her up? All right. Wake up, Dan. Come on, wake up. Just in case it didn't. Okay. You're asking what are the similarities between Christianity and indigenous beliefs? Well, again, I can't talk about all of them because they're all, but um, my peoples, the Ojibwe peoples, it's not that dissimilar. See if you hear any similarities. We believe that there's a creator, and that the creator created Turtle Island, which is also known as North America or this planet, depending on who you talk to. And that we people have a special relationship with the creator. But we also have a relationship with everything, all the animals, all the plants, and that we're supposed to live in harmony with each other and with our surroundings. Does that sound anything like Christianity? Yeah. That we're supposed to find peace and love around us, and we're supposed to spread that on to others. Probably the biggest point, difference is we don't have necessarily a Jesus figure within the Ojibwe belief system. But you look at the 7 teachings, which is pretty universal across many different indigenous cultures, about honor, respect, integrity, so on and so on. These are all things you will find in Scripture. I have found personally, because I was growing up as a pretty extreme Pentecostal Christian. Like I know technically this church is Pentecostal. I don't know if you guys wear that banner too heavily. But I grew up in an even more extreme version of it, where women were supposed to wear skirts and not wear makeup and basically pump out babies and cook the meals. And that's because that's where my mom took me. Because, there are, ironically, a lot of indigenous peoples that are Christians. So, anyways, my faith has progressed over the years. I spent many years being a pastor. I'm on the same ranks as Greg and others. And there was a time in my past, because of my past, I was also of the opinion that I either had to be a Christian or I worship in the indigenous ways. They were there and there. They were very separate. In fact, this one is kind of evil and maybe demonic and et cetera, something to be scared of. Long story short, I no longer am a credentialed minister. And I have come to realize that my indigenous culture and history and teachings are not only not evil, they actually enrich my life. They enrich my connection to the Creator. They enrich my outlook, and that the vast majority of the ways they are complementary and they make each other better. There are a lot of Christians, both non-Indigenous and Indigenous, that will strongly disagree with me. In fact, back was 8 years ago, I think, I brought out a friend called Richard Twist. I think Tammy remembers him. And he was a good friend that really helped me started growing on this journey. And it was to the point that the group of pastors that Greg and I belonged to, we were at a conference, and one of the higher ranking guys, I would say, not trying to be mean or anything like that, I think out of genuine concern, he's like, okay, Kyle, we hear that you're bringing this guy in. I guess some of them looked him up online and saw some of his things, and they're really, really concerned. Do you know what he teaches? I'm like, yeah, fully do, yep. That's why I'm bringing him. And he's like, well, these 5 pastors who are pastoring 5 churches here in the community, so they're really concerned about it. They're really concerned about you. I said, well, who are they? He says, well, they don't want their names named. When I said to this person, I said, look, you're one of my higher ups. I'm going to assume you know Scripture better than I do. You tell me their names so I can have a direct conversation with them, or this conversation's over. And he says, well, I can't share their names. I'm like, okay, then we're done talking. Didn't take rocket science to figure it out, because those 5 churches stopped supporting the organization I was running. but there's a lot of pushback towards it. There's still a lot of people that will not agree with me that that the Creator, God, is everywhere. Christianity does not have a monopoly or the market when it comes to connecting with the Creator. The Creator God existed in these lands long before any white person got here. I fully believe that people lived and died here in Canada, or what is now known as Canada, lived and died for time immemorial, and when I die, I will get to see them in the afterlife. Long before anybody heard of this figure named Jesus. I do think Jesus obviously helps focus and brings things into perspective, and I count myself as a follower of Jesus. And by the way, you'll notice I don't use a certain term to describe my faith. But the teachings of Jesus do form who I am, along with my Indigenous teachings as well that I've been growing in the last 10, 15 years. But am I wrong, Greg, in thinking that the further I've gone down this road, the more tension I had with our group of pastors? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, but he was aware of some conversations. Yeah. Yeah.
So, knowing you for a long time, and having great respect for you, I have a personal question for you, and you can choose to answer or not. Sharing like this has got to be emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally, all of the things, taxing. What do you do, Kyle, for self-care when you share? Because my concern is for the Indigenous people of Canada, but also for you as a friend in your sharing.
Oh, I appreciate the question. One of the things I do is I limit how often I have these conversations. You may have even noticed there was a couple points where I started getting a bit more emotional, and I purposely went away, changed the topic. But particularly when the news broke about the 215 and then the growing number since, a lot of people, really good, well-intentioned people, wanted to learn more and know more. So having the conversation over and over again, it was very taxing. So I limit the number of conversations I have. I will take time before and after to be alone, to connect with the Creator, that kind of stuff. I also go home and watch some Star Trek: The Next Generation tonight, because that's how I turn my brain off at night. Yeah. So there's a number of different things I do for self-care that way as well. Also, my son, very helpful to help bring life. Yeah.
So I want to get back to the question you asked me.
Yeah.
Tammy's right. I can't speak for the intention or the intentionality of others, but I can speak to this, that I have come across a mindset that we would a lot of times try and bring people into Christianity and change everything about them. And I don't think that's unique to Canada.
No.
I think that you get into European Christianity and the Doctrine of Discovery, where basically if you were if they were Christian, then you had to treat them as equals. If they were not Christian, then you had to.
They were not people.
You didn't have to. They were not people that you had to honor.
Yeah.
And that doctrine has been one of the most evil things that has perpetuated all kinds of evil all over the world in the name of Jesus.
Including mindsets here in this room. So who here knows about the Doctrine of Discovery? All right, a decent number. More than usual. So
Go ahead, explain it.
Yeah, the cliff notes of the Doctrine of Discovery, it started off with one of the popes, because England and France and Portugal and so on, they were colonizing the world, and they had this little problem. Everywhere they went, there were people there, and they're like, "What do we do?" Well, and basically the Pope said, well, they're not Christians, so they're not really people, so you don't have to really treat them with respect or love or equality. Just they're not people, so feel free to kill them, get rid of them, whatever, and you can feel free to discover the land that has millions of people and have been there forever. But feel free to discover it. Just like next week, I'm going to come over to Greg's house and I'm going to discover his house for my people. So that is the basis of a lot of things, including Canadian law and including Christianity of all stripes, not just the Catholics, but everybody, including all stripes of Christianity, is that to be Christian is to be white, basically. We often don't say it that bluntly, but that's the way it is. Because who here has ever seen pictures of Jesus with blonde hair, blue eyes, looking very white? And who ever here thought like, oh dear, that's wrong? But who here, let's be honest, who here has ever seen a picture of a black Jesus and said, oh, that's weird? Anybody? Yeah, like honestly, there have been times I'm like, oh, that Jesus, he's very black, or he looks Asian or something, but that's just as wrong or just the same as Jesus being a very white guy. Everything you see of Jesus in media, like he's a very good-looking, cut, white dude with a nice tan. Am I wrong? Jesus is always super hot, isn't he? It's like, do I worship him or do I flirt with him? I can't tell. Does he flirt with me? You know, so, but the idea is that if they're not Christian, it is also the basis of Canadian law, in the sense that that's how the Crown has had the authority to take Canada, or to ignore the treaties. It's because that's the basis. They have nuanced it, they've changed the language, all that kind of stuff, but that's the basis of it. And then we still see that even in today's churches, in some real ways. There have been many, many times, I think I told you this last time we talked on the phone, where if a church, let's say a church, I want to pick the church down the road. Let's say they're going to do a trip. They're going to take their teens, or they're going to take a group of people, and they're going to go to Brandon for a VBS or something like that. They're going to go partner with or work with the local church out there. They're going to go and, work alongside partners. But the same group, if they go to Mexico or any place where there might be some brown people or black people, it becomes a mission trip. Or even if they go up to Indigenous Community, or even the North End, it becomes a mission trip. One is working with partners, one is a mission trip. Do you see the difference? One is us together, one is us and them, higher and lower. And be honest, have you ever thought that same too? Or like, have you ever gone to a First Nation community or gone to Mexico or something and you've gone on a mission trip? A lot of people who grew up in the church did that. That is it can trace all its way back to the Doctrine of Discovery. To be Christian is to be European, aka white.
And so that's the mindset that I feel like you butted up against. Was that, yes, you need to think like a European Canadian would in order to truly fit into what our church family was about. And and if you're somebody who is a person of color, if you have felt that, some of it is an underlying gravitational pull. And I'm sorry that if you felt that you have felt that, especially if it's here, but if anywhere, I'm sorry that you've had to endure that, because it's not right. Because Christ came to redeem all people, no nations, there's not a preferred vein of Christianity. Just like there's not a preferred denomination.
Well, the Baptists got it pretty good. No, just kidding.
But
You know,
I hope you get what I'm saying here is Jesus transcends cultures. He transcended it in the Bible. And if we truly believe what the Bible says, then, we're not, our primary identity is Christ first, and then the differences are celebrated inside of that kingdom, not to be all assimilated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because let me pose a question to you. So why would you ever come across a group of people who are Christians, say in the countryside of Uganda, sitting in a church like this, sitting in pews, wearing suits and dresses? Why? It's because the colonizers brought that with them, and they said, this is the way to worship God. And by the way, this is the one true God. So it all comes from that, again, to be Christian is to be European, to be Christian is to be white. People don't often say that bluntly, but that is the underlying basis of it. That is why people don't flinch when they see a white Jesus, but they go, what? If they see an Asian Jesus, that kind of stuff. Or even if they see a Jewish Jesus, oh my word, they'll be like, that seems wrong somehow. Yeah. But yeah, like I said, it gives Canada, or gave them the legal right to conquer the land, not the people, because Indigenous peoples never gave up our sovereignty. We are still sovereign people, which I'm going to take a moment to talk about treaties. Because you start off tonight with acknowledging Treaty 1 and the Métis, which good. I would challenge you to say you should do that every week. But who here would say they know about treaties? Like, why do we people do the treaty acknowledgement? Anybody? Yeah, okay, just so it's mic'd. So say they're to recognize the agreement between the Indigenous peoples and the Crown. Yeah. And that's essentially it, but let me go into a bit more of it is treaty. You can interchange the word treaty for the word contract, or if you want to get all Christian, covenant. So the difference between a contract and a treaty is one sovereign nation enters into a contract with another sovereign nation, aka they do a treaty. That's the difference. Greg and I, we're two individuals. We can get a treaty going, or a contract going, but we're not two sovereign nations, so we can't get a treaty going. That's really the only difference. So Treaty 1 is, we're on Treaty 1 territory, meaning that when Canada wanted to come this way and to establish themselves, they came into a treaty to share this land. Not to take it over, to share it as equal partners. That's often a misconception, is that the treaty gave the land and the resources to Canada. Like, no. The agreement was to share it equally. But of course, it was ignored, and they brought in the Indian Act, which we talked about. But that's how the colonizers saw it. They saw it as a contract and to break the contract. They didn't enter the contract in good faith. And so anytime you see the treaty rights being reaffirmed or fought in court, we're still fighting for our rights that way. But to take it away from the idea of contract, and let's more make it a covenant or a relationship, my elders and knowledge keepers have told me that the treaties should be looked more like a marriage between peoples. That when me and my partner got married, it wasn't a contract. I wasn't marrying her to gain something financially or anything like that. I wasn't marrying rich or anything like that. But I married her because I love her and I wanted to build my life with her. Now, marriage is a legally binding agreement. It is a contract. There's do's and don'ts, and there's consequences if you break it and all that kind of stuff. But that's not the purpose of the marriage. The marriage is to bring people together and to live together, to build a life together, to have ideally offspring together, if that's what you want. But it's about relationship. So from the Indigenous perspective, particularly here in Treaty 1, that's what it was. We saw it as bringing and enlarging our family. So not only was the contract broken, you've been abusive, unfaithful, murderous partners, spouses. And I will say this, you will notice that Indigenous peoples were not asking to kick all the white people out of this country, go back where you came from. We're asking for the treaties to be honored. We're asking for the relationship to be healed. Even though you tried to kill us and murder us and cheat us and all that kind of stuff, we're still wanting to repair that relationship. That's what reconciliation is all about. We're trying to reconcile the relationship. Any other questions on anything we talked about or not?
I don't think I'll get to you.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine. I ended up in a conversation recently with another white person about, it was about the lack of clean drinking water on some reserves. And
I'm so happy you brought this up.
yeah,
Yeah, okay.
that's an enormous issue in itself. One of the places the conversation went was I had brought that up about how, again, the under-resourced nature of it. But this person had grown up near a reserve, and the comment she had made was, oh, well, I personally saw, there was wood brought into the community to build a school, but by the time the people to build the school got there, the wood had all been burned or used. And just
They're probably cold.
Yeah. Yeah. And so as a white person who has not had much experience with Indigenous communities or like I could speculate about, psychology and poverty mindsets and all those sorts of things, but it just kind of left me at a loss to say like, okay, well, that's your personal experience. All I have is book knowledge, and I don't know.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate your comments. So they are Indigenous communities. They are in communities, but again, they haven't always been communities. They've been camps, imprisonments. It's not like they had these healthy, thriving little communities. No, they were forced to be there, and they didn't have all the mechanisms of a healthy community, including all the kids. So it's generations of that, decades of that. So yeah, people did not always make healthy choices or the community right choices because it wasn't really a community. It was a prison. And who here would ever say, well, I grew up next to a prison. I grew up in Stoney, and I see those guys behind those bars not really having a thriving community. It's not a thriving community. Yeah. And you mentioned the water. Yeah, the numbers are too slowly going down, but there are still about 80 First Nations communities that cannot drink their own water. And people will say, well, it's too expensive. It costs about $4 billion. Well, if there was 80 small towns in this country that couldn't drink their water, I think Canada would do something about it. We just saw the last year and a half, the government can just basically print money and get it out to the people because it was needed. But when it comes to Indigenous communities, how much is that going to cost? Can we do that in installments? Can we do one community a year? Can we do that? Yeah. What's the bare minimum we can do? Also, speaking of bare minimums, let me talk about education for a moment. If, and this is a huge if an Indigenous kid grows up and graduates high school on the reserve, he or she or they, when they come to the community, are automatically at a disadvantage because their grade 12 education is about equivalent of a grade 8 education here in the city. Because Indigenous schools are intentionally, knowingly underfunded to the tune of about 60% of a school here in the city or in any other community in Manitoba. We know it. People actually somehow budget that amount less every year. It's not by accident. Schools are intentionally underfunded. So if somebody graduates high school, they come to the community or they come to the university, there's this huge gap. And it just can perpetuate and get worse and worse and worse and worse. Because also, one of the ways these schools try to make ends meet is they pay their teachers less. There's no such thing as extracurricular activities. And who here, if they graduate from university, probably have a considerable amount of debt themselves. I'm going to go work in Winnipeg 1 for this amount, or I'm going to go work in Peguis for a lot less. And they're probably going to choose Winnipeg 1. Or if they get a job over here, they're going to get out of there as soon as possible to the high-paying job. That's what most people would do, which means they have a much higher turnover rate of teachers and educators, and therefore a lot less relationship building, a lot less consistency. Yeah, Tammy's saying we probably don't get the best teachers. You're absolutely right. No, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's some really stellar, committed teachers out there that are out there because they are filled with passion and grace and all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, people are not going to stay there for their entire career because they want to. They're going to go find a better quote-unquote job someplace else. Yeah. And again, turnover is always harmful. It always, anywhere, whether it's a job or church or whatever, you always have to restart. And you can never get momentum. Guys, we're going long, so let's keep asking some questions here.
You talked about how your ancestor, Chief Peguis, was converted to Christianity. Do you believe that's willingly or is that non-willingly? Just wondering, you talked about your own journey with being a Jesus follower. How do you think historically through your family?
It's a good question. I've never heard of him doing it grudgingly. I haven't heard that story. That, as far as I know, that story doesn't exist in the community. Because Peguis and Lord Selkirk were good friends at first. And the relationship was good at first. But of course, we always have to say at first because we all know what happened. No, I've never heard a story about him doing it grudgingly or not authentically or that kind of stuff. Yeah. He's coming with a mic.
When you talk to other Indigenous pastors or Christian leaders who disagree with you about being able to kind of maintain both Christian beliefs and traditional Indigenous beliefs, how do those conversations go, and what do you talk about to encourage folks to explore, I guess, both?
So yes, how those conversations goes whenever I talk to a fellow Indigenous leader who disagrees with me, I tell them that they're wrong and they're colonized. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I might say that, but I do say that, but in a more gentle, more relational way. But I can understand because we're all at a different point in this journey of decolonizing Christianity and ourselves, all that kind of stuff. So not that I think less of them or judge them, but I do think they're mistaken. So I will actually use some of the points that Greg stole from me earlier. I'll say that God created all the peoples of this land, and that Christianity, if that's your thing, should look, sound, feel, and even smell different in every part of the world. That every culture on this planet adds to a piece to the puzzle. So why are we trying to get rid of all the pieces and trying to only focus on this one piece over here? That, like I said earlier, Christianity does not have a monopoly when it comes to the Creator and God and goodness and righteousness. But again, people can also take some extra time when it comes to understanding that the Indigenous cultures' teachings are not incompatible with Christianity, that they actually, like I said earlier, enrich. But sometimes that understanding just takes longer and longer for them to get. And I'm trying to be understanding and patient. But actually, I do think there's every year more and more progress that way. But some people are just going to keep saying that, and that's fine. You know, we're still going to love them. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Like, for some context, I work with mostly Indigenous teenagers, some adults, and in sort of a school. And being a non-Indigenous person myself, I don't think I'm the right person to sort of speak to them specifically when they're trying to like struggle through reconciling their traditional beliefs and their some of their Christian beliefs, not all of them, but some of them. And I don't really know where to like encourage them to like have conversations with other Indigenous Christians who are trying to figure that out. Do you have any recommendations for places?
This is like a high school or something, or?
Yes, sort of.
Okay. Well, encourage them, or the powers that be, to bring in knowledge keepers, speakers, that kind of stuff. I know a really good-looking, handsome Indigenous speaker that can come and sit in circles and is available. So. You're talking about your dad, right? Yeah, exactly. But yeah, you're right. Respectfully, you're not the right person. They should be ideally mentored or in conversation with elders or knowledge keepers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bouncing off of Shanna's question there, I recently read a book called Stolen City by Owen Taves, and he talks about the gentrification of the urban center of Winnipeg, specifically near Portage in Maine, and like how it was supposed to be an Indigenous cultural center, and then that the Thunderbird House was built, and then all the funding dried up. Just for context for everybody, and then there's been Christian organizations also in that area that have put down roots to do ministry as well. How, like, this might be getting ahead of where you're going, but how do you see Christianity not revitalizing, but being a partner in restoring the cultural significance to Indigenous people? And also, yeah.
Good question. We're going to save that for a couple more minutes because that's going to be a part of our conversation about next steps. So any questions from anybody that is not the white guy in the white shirt? No disrespect. What's your name, by the way? All right, cool. All right.
Got one here.
Yeah.
For Indigenous communities in Canada, do they mostly, I don't want to say cooperate, but do they mostly kind of interact or work with the federal government, or is it provincial governments? And is there a particular maybe province that they work better with, or is it generally all not very well?
Sir, I missed it. You're talking about First Nation communities, like First Nations?
Yes.
Okay, and also Métis and Inuit.
Exactly.
Yeah, good question. So all the First Nations, what we formerly call reserves and that kind of stuff, that is all federal land. Which, by the way, one of the misconceptions is like it's a tax-free paradise where we all just go and put on our loincloths and run free and not pay taxes. That's not what it's like. You don't want to see me in a loincloth. This is, but it is federal land that no individual owns. Like not the people that live there. So it's still technically controlled by the Crown. So if somebody has I'll tie into like somebody has a house on a First Nation, they don't own the land. They're not building wealth from land ownership, all that kind of stuff. That is another way of privilege off the community. But you're asking about partnerships and relationships with the governments. So First Nations in the Métis, here locally it's the Manitoba Métis Federation, and there's a smaller number of Inuit, but they have their association as well. all have direct connections, have direct conversations with the federal government, primarily. That's where the funds primarily come from. But it is confusing at times. And sometimes tragically, I won't go into details because it's a sad story, and we're out of time. But look up Jordan's principle. We want to talk about the fight between federal and provincial governments, and young Jordan herself. Jordan's principle. Trigger warning, but go look it up. Because are we Manitobans? Are we Canadians? Are we Indigenous peoples? It is a bit gray. But the chief of a community is more likely to call up the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and then they are to call the Premier or the Mayor or the Reeve, that kind of stuff. And how often do they get together? First Nation communities, you've ever seen in the news people called Grand Chiefs? Yeah. Grand Chiefs, how they're organized, at least here in Manitoba, is Southern and Northern, and then kind of the whole thing. And there's Grand Chiefs, so there's or even Treaty 1, we're organizing. So, stronger, the more are you, the stronger voice you have. So if you hear that, like the National Chief, the Grand Chiefs, those are groupings. They're the Grand Chief or the National Chief of a group. And how well we work or get along with governments depends on the government. Depends on the individuals. There are governments with good hair that talk good talk, but don't always have the follow-up action. Or there's elected leaders who are about to retire who grew up next to a reserve who apparently knows all the stuff to know. But large in a way, it has been more adversarial than it has not been. Because, again, these days you'll hear more, we're going to have nation-to-nation relationships, but it's still not that. There's still a Department of Indigenous Affairs and so on and so on. But Indigenous peoples, we have not surrendered our inherent Indigenous rights to the land and to our own sovereignty. So every time that is betrayed, the governments are breaking the law. Mm-hmm. I hope I covered up my, I wasn't, what governments I was referring to.
Got one more question, Kyle, and then I think we need to shift gears.
All right.
Question. Without choosing any kind of political side or anything, with the elections coming up,
he ran federally for the NDP in the last election, so he might be biased.
So my question pretty much was going to just be like, from the Indigenous community perspective, what kind of things are the Indigenous community looking for in the elections? Like, what kind of topics are they looking for?
Well, for different reasons. Indigenous people, we don't vote at the same rate as everybody else, which in some ways I sometimes get upset about, and sometimes I can understand, because a lot of people say, well, why participate in that colonial system? But if we did vote at the same rate or better, the Indigenous vote, it's not uniform, of course, but the Assembly of Chiefs nationally figured out that if we were to vote in mass and kind of pick a side, we would be the deciders of 52 ridings in this country. And if we did vote in mass and pick a side, all of a sudden I think the political parties would start changing their tune because they want to get those seats, right? But yeah, so there's Indigenous peoples that will support every party. The numbers seem to suggest the last federal election, in different parts of the country, they tended to vote in more liberal than the others. Which, if you look at history, I don't get. The Liberals were in power for 70% of the 1900s. They're the party of the Indian Act and so on and so on. And when they weren't in power, the Conservatives were in power. And when you're Indigenous, it doesn't really matter if they're blue or they're red. They have the same outcomes anyways. And so, yeah, full disclosure, Greg is right. I did run in the last federal election as part of the NDP, and I'm still a card-carrying member of that, and I'm probably going to go down to the campaign office after I leave here, because I'm not running in this election. But that being said, I would like to think it'd be different if the NDP got in power. Things would be different, but if that were to happen, time will tell, right? But again, it also doesn't really matter who's in power. There are still these laws that are in place that are unjust, that are illegal, and that are still perpetuating colonization that need to change. For example, the federal government is still fighting survivors in court because, according to the system set up, they have the fiduciary responsibility to do that. They shouldn't. They should stop. But the federal government is currently taking or fighting survivors in court.
Quick follow.
Mm-hmm.
And so you were saying how about how maybe or why.
You gotta speak up, dude.
Oh yeah, okay. So you were saying how like there's not as many people that vote from the Indigenous community as it because of the colonial thing and all that.
Colonization, poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
We also have less polling stations in First Nations communities per capita. But sorry, go on.
yeah, no, I was just gonna ask like you indicate or you mentioned how that's now available to them to do that, and so I was just wondering like if the idea is that they could make a difference, why aren't they wanting to make that difference?
It's a very good question, and technology might be changing that. Like, but the Assembly of First Nations, which is kind of our national organizing body, their primary funder is the federal government. So, like charities and churches, they're not allowed to formally pick sides. So they can't say, okay, this election, we're all going this way, you know. The best they can do is like try to encourage people to vote. And there are movements towards that, like the Manitoba version of that assembly, and even movements in the North End are always like, get out, go and vote. Here's how you vote. Here's where you vote. All that kind of stuff. Your vote counts. So the voting rate is slowly increasing, but it's still lagging way behind. The North End has the highest concentration of Indigenous peoples in North America, and on a personal matter, I wish they all would have voted en masse last time because I would have had a different job right now. But yeah, it's a long, complex thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, Greg, I know you're the pastor, but I'm the guest, so I'm going to say one more question, and then we're going to move on. I know we're going long. I'm abusing my my position, but that's how it feels.
Young.
A question is like, I'm not very familiar with like resource. So if, for example, in a resource area, you do have some natural, like a lake can, fishing can be commercialized or a piece of land, is there any way to collaborate on that region to like some business model to help to get out of poverty, to make it like economic sustainability to solve the problem instead keep rely on politicians and beg for land? Like, do they allow you guys to do that? Because you're saying the land belong to federal, so I don't know how much difference. Because
the short answer is no, they don't really allow that. All the crown land, like I said, is largely stolen and or breaking treaty over it. Canada is an extremely wealthy nation, and it's extremely wealthy because of its natural resources. And these treaties were intended to share those resources, and it's been ignored. So that's a very long and complex question to be answered. So I'll just try to find a short version of a way of saying it is, so if a company wants to, say, go mine in northern Manitoba, they will need permission from the Crown to do it. By treaty, they're supposed to share that. They don't. So the Crown gets enriched by the corporation gets enriched, and so on. And the people of the land don't. And it's a blatantly illegal and not honoring the treaties. Yeah. All right, unless there's one really, really, really pressing question, you can ask me after, but I want to take a couple minutes to talk about next steps, because I don't want to end on this note. So kind of go to your question. What can you do as individuals? What can you do as a church? Can you do as a faith? The high points are get as well informed as you can. Whether you're new to Canada or you've been here your entire life, learn and research. There are a ton of books out there. Google can point you in the right directions, all that kind of stuff. Greg can give you my contact information. I'm happy to point you in some directions as well. But get informed. Also expand your worldview a little bit, meaning that be conscious of where you consume your news. There's a station called APTN, Aboriginal People's Television Network. They have a legit, fully respected, award-winning news department. They're online. They're on social media. They got their websites. So read the news from their perspective. Also, I have the CBC News app on my phone. There's a section in there. You can go look by province or entertainment or politics. There's also an Indigenous section. Read stories from there. Get to know Indigenous peoples. Go listen to their stories. Go attend events. Go attend powwows. Go attend ceremonies. You're going to feel like an outsider, but you're going to be welcomed. And so expand your worldview. Expand where you do your consuming of news, and do your own research. And when you have relationships with Indigenous peoples, they will be happy to bring you on that journey, as Greg and I have been doing. Greg just called me up and said, "Hey, can we talk?" And I'm like, "Sure, let's do it." And that's happened numerous times over the years. But as a church, stick with the individuals. So when you are better informed and you actually have a relationship with Indigenous peoples, be an advocate. But don't be a white savior. Don't do it for us. Do it with us. In fact, there's this mantra that is out there that I fully agree with. Nothing for us without us. Like, it'd be similar to having a group of men saying, "We're going to advance women's rights." Really? Really? No, like, you men, we can go and sit and learn and follow the lead of women, but we're going to let them do it, and we're going to support them, and we're going to advocate and speak up for women's rights in our circles with our friends, our family, our spheres of influence. We're going to call out all that kind of stuff when you see it, hear it, all that kind of stuff. Same thing when it comes to Indigenous topics. Remember, topics, not issues. You're informed, you have relationships. When you hear racist or outdated things, say something. Don't let it slide. Speak against it. But always follow the lead. If you do attend an event or that kind of stuff, follow the lead of the Indigenous peoples that are there. Don't take a leadership role. Take a supporting role. But we need you there. We want you there. We don't want it to be alone. We want to have you as friends, and we want to have you as allies. Because it's one thing for me as an Indigenous man to advocate for my people and my rights. Is another thing if you come and join me and you do it within your spheres as well. And as a church, keep this conversation going amongst yourselves. I can even send you guys some videos you guys can watch at home and you guys can keep talking about. Keep acknowledging the treaty. And just keep learning, keep growing, and making sure that if you become parents one day, you teach and train your kids different. And I'm assuming most of you are post-secondary students, or you have been recently, or if you're going to be. Ask those questions in your classes. Ask those questions. Have those expectations of your professors. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Me and everybody else, we're going to appreciate a question because it means that you want to be a friend, you want to be an ally, and we want that more than we want some guy at McDonald's talking about dirty Indians, which is something I've heard a few times. All right, so we've gone way over time, so I'm going to pass it back to the white guy.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for making us feel really uncomfortable.
You're welcome.
We could feel that here in the room, that there's lots of tension, that there was lots of tension. Thank you all for participating.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen without questions and clarification, and even being here and showing up. And I know some of you are here just to hear what Kyle had to offer. And if that's why you're here, that's great, because that's the showing up he talks about. Let me be a little pastoral here. There are things that we can do that we were challenged to, but I want to remind us, continue to pray, continue to, bring these topics before God, but realize that as you bring these topics before God, He may turn it back to you and go, okay, I'm going to ask you to act. And you said it. You said it earlier that as a Christian, we're called to reach out to the marginalized. And you know what? It's awesome when it's all fun. It sucks when it costs you something. But here's the thing is, it always costs you something. And be prepared. Be prepared to go in. And if you want to make inroads, that there are things that are going to cost you time, money, energy, and even some relationships or uncomfortableness in your relationships. That's okay. Jesus experienced that same thing. Jesus taught that. It's 2,000 years of Jesus asking us and telling us to live different and follow His modeling. And, whatever He calls you into, because it's not a ministry calling as far as professional ministry. Jesus has put a call on each one of our lives to do something and follow Him. And you know what? He encourages us to take stock of the cross, but then to boldly go and take that cost and go for it. And so I would just challenge you to take the stories that broke your heart, take the things that you sit with and go, oh man, that makes me so angry, and turn that back over to God and go, God, what? Now that I know, what am I supposed to do? Because He guides us, He strengthens us, and He gives us wisdom. And so, thank you, Kyle. Once again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I will provide Kyle's, all of his contact information.
Sure,
well,
yeah.
Kyle's very open to talk about a lot of this stuff and point us in the right direction and stuff like that. So if you want follow-up conversations, please feel free to, make contact with him here tonight, or let me know during the week. If anything here really offended you, I do want to hear.
Me too.
And it's you know what, Greg, this really bothered me that this was said or this was this. And it's you know what? Even if you don't agree and you're I want to talk about this, please, let's talk. Because we're family, and family doesn't always get along, but family always has each other's back, and we want to continue in relationships. So if you're I don't agree with everything he said, like I said, Kyle and I don't agree. We vote for different parties. We look at things a lot different, but there's a lot of good things that we look together and go, how can we move forward together? And so,
yeah. You really should stop voting for the Pirate Party. But yeah,
oh man! Okay, I've got to stop. Let me pray, and then we can be done, and then I can say what? No. Lord God, we just come before you, and Lord, we thank you for the ability to have this conversation tonight. And Lord, we believe that each one of us here has a part to play in sharing your love, because God, the whole Christian story is a message of reconciliation between you and us. And Lord, your scripture says that we are part of the ministry of reconciliation. And so, Lord, help us to be part of that here in this land with the indigenous peoples and all the peoples that are settled here. In your name we pray. Amen.
Yeah, thank you, friends. Let's just go with this. Know better, do better.